Ran, did you identify with that statement from Dean that the bit that he enjoys most is the pain?
Yeah, I mean, if it's all white ahead for the next 1800, and you've already got crutch rot and gangrene, and you're beginning to think, because nobody's done it before, rather like what you were saying, Steve, maybe you can't do it. Maybe humans can't actually tow that sort of weight for that far on that number of calories. And we could only carry 5,000, and we were using 8,500 every day sort of thing. So it was on the thing. And you were talking about faith. I was just brought up in South Africa with a sort of vague, normal faith, but not enough to deal with gangrene and crutch rot. So you have to develop something else. And I sort of think, well, my dad and my granddad, not that I ever met them, but I was brought up on stories about them, are watching me, and I don't want to do something to let them down. So I don't want to be the one who gives up, but I do want to give up. Therefore, in the tent every night, you're watching the other bloke hoping he's broken his leg or something.
So it'll be him, not me. And I know, Steve, a lot of athletes sort of keep that thought in their head, he's hurting more than I am.
Certainly, very, very different situation. I didn't like pain very much. And while I only did races that lasted 6 minutes and not a few years, when you're in that competition and you think you're favourites and you're side by side, or in fact maybe down on the opposition, you're thinking, well, if we're favourites, that must be hurting them more than it's hurting us. So if we can keep the pressure on them, they're going to falter. They might not, you don't know, but that's the mental process you have to go through. As soon as you think you're beaten, you are beaten, as simple as that. So even if they are better than you and performing better than you, you've still got to believe that you're in the race right the way through. And if they're leading, that's got to be hurting them a hell of a lot more it's hurting me. And you use different elements around you. So being in a race that has 6 crews, and you're one of them, so there's 5 other people, somebody may be out in the lead, you're using somebody else to keep you in the race at that time.
And I suppose actually, you know, for 3 of you, endurance and stamina is the key. John, for you, yes, there is an element of endurance, but you're thinking tactically all the time. You're trying to read the opposition. You're trying to outwit them in real time and react against them.
Yeah, that's a really important component for us. And I think, you know, being like from Australia with the rugby, we always thought rugby's not the main sport in Australia. Like we have 4 main football codes, and rugby on different measures sits 3rd or 4th on that. So it's we're reasonably a boutique sport in Australia. So we didn't necessarily have the pick of the best athletes in rugby, but what we found is that we were competing against sides like the All Blacks, who are usually the best in the world, or the Springboks, who are the toughest in the world in many respects, or the French, and all these teams. We thought we're probably not going to. We'll work as hard as we can to be as good as we can, but we're probably not going to be the fastest. We're probably not going to be the strongest in many respects, but we'll be as strong as we can. But in that case, we have to be the smartest, and so tactics were really important for us. We considered ourselves. Sounds probably strange when you're talking about rugby, but a cerebral team. It was so important that we chose our tactics and were very specific for them against each opposition, and we're able to change tactics, in the middle of a half, not get back at half time and chat to the coach and get some feedback. It was about changing them on the run.
Dean, you talked about the percentage that was body and the percentage that was mind. Training your body is one thing, and you can probably write, very clear manuals of how people, if they wanted to, could follow that program. But how do you train your mind for the length of time that you're having to concentrate?
It's discipline. A lot of it comes down to discipline. A lot of it comes down to pushing yourself to failure and seeing where that edge is and stepping over the edge. I think we're so trained to avoid failure that failure is failure, is permanent. And to me, I embrace failure. I celebrate it. I've had some spectacular failures, and I've certainly learned a lot more from my failures than any victory. I mean, in victory, it's celebratory, and you're kind of caught up in the moment. In failure, there's all sorts of analysis going on. You're looking at precisely where did this break down, or how could I have gone further. And so I think not being afraid to fail is certainly a key element that that I actually say, you know, fail wonderfully.
Which is interesting, because I know that one of the free classes that Google offers its employees, its team, is absolutely addressing that, and how do we create a culture in which we can accept failure without obviously inviting it in. And John, it's a point particularly in a team, and you talked about it, about, you know, being able to look at each other honestly afterwards and actually saying, right, let's together move on from this.
I think it's about being willing to fail little but often, and learning from those mistakes as you go along, and being able to embrace it and embrace the learnings as you go through that.
How much of a challenge, Steve and John, have you found it adapting to life post-sport, in the terms that sport kind of dictates your timetable so strictly, that finding new challenges for yourself and actually breaking into worlds that you may have found a little nerve-wracking to start with? How have you found it?
Well, people said to me, you're going to find it really difficult to retire. I competed at the highest level for just over 20 years, and that it was the easiest thing I ever did. But the problem is that there was no money in my sport, so I had to stop playing and then find a mechanism of making money from that point of view. But then I find that I have to put challenges. I like exercise, I like to try and keep fit, but if there's no end goal, I find myself not doing it. So I have to set myself a challenge of some sort to be able to get there. And you
do that to yourself? It's not Anne, your wife, in the way that Ranulph's wife has said, come on, let's find something.
Her views have changed a great deal of when I first stopped, that she certainly wanted me to stop, and after a few months she was very happy if I went to go for the next 10 Olympics after that to keep me out of the house.
John, how have you found it adapting?
Oh, look, I've loved it. I got to the end, like I just wanted to do something else. I think you start to rationalise a little bit what you're doing, and it's probably time to leave rugby if you're starting to rationalise too much what you're doing. But an Irishman once said to me, he said, you know, the most important thing in life is you've got to love what you do, not what you did. And to me, that, you know, that just resonated so clearly. It's about living in the present for the future. And so, you know, another great mate of mine always said that you retired to something, not from something. And I think those bits of advice are really, really important. So
plotting the next challenge is absolutely crucial to all of you. And Ranulph, you touched on it briefly. The next challenge for you will be?
Yeah, the doctor, Mike Stroud, who has these weird ideas, he heard 3 years ago that the biggest polar expedition of all time, crossing Antarctica during the polar winter, total darkness, you're not allowed to by your government. You won't get a permit because there's no rescue facility for 4,000 miles. And the average temperature is minus 73 degrees centigrade, and lung tissue starts being damaged around about minus 60, something like that. So we started work on that 3 years ago. We needed £5.2 million, and I've got a big meeting this afternoon, try and get another million out of someone. Yeah. So it goes on, and as long as the records haven't all been broken, and as long as we're ahead of the Norwegians...
which actually brings me to a point that rivalry can be, if you approach it in the right way, can be extremely important. And sometimes anger can be useful. And I'm not saying that you're angry with the Norwegians, not at all, but the rivalry is very important to you.
Yeah, I mean, there are nasty tricks sort of thing, and I don't want to be vulgar, but in about the 1970s, we were breaking the world record with a guy called Charlie Burton to the North Pole, and the Bergens Tidende in Norway came up with this article saying the Brits have just beaten the world record, but our boys are catching them up. And the guy, the leader at that time, Ragnar Thorsketh, and Charlie, who was captain of Army Rugby for a long time, my mate, said, Thorsketh, can't pronounce that, we'll call him Foreskin. And I think the Norwegians heard this, and in Bergens Tidende newspaper it said, a bit later than that, but the Brits are carrying a prostitute on their sledge. We didn't even have a toothbrush because it weighed too much. And at minus 40, certain things are not practical anyway. So but the point was, Mr. Jimison of the News of the World reported that from the Norwegian papers into the British newspapers. We lost 3 major sponsors as a result of that. So us and the Norwegians ever since have not been, the best of pals.
They spur you on, though. Steve, what was your attitude to rival teams?
that you need rival teams because that's what pushes you through the boundaries in some ways. It's hard pushing yourself. So if there are other people out there that are also pushing the limits of being able to do that, but you've got to be really in control of what you're doing. And what sports psychologists would control the controllables is that it's good to have opposition out there. But when it actually came to racing, is that I wouldn't be over-friendly with the opposition that I was racing, but I wouldn't be upset them either. If you upset them, they go out and try harder to beat you. So it's sort of middle of the road in some respects. Don't give them the excuse to pull harder, to train harder, to try and beat you. Be very neutral from that point of view. But in here, hate them.
John, you were always very composed, or you seemed to be, and you didn't really go for riling the opposition. Everybody loved you. You know, I mean, extraordinary position to be in, that rival teams actually.
Yeah, look, it probably had a bit to do, you know, with what Steve said there. I think, you know, we were desperately competitive in everything we did, and that, you know, it was a very intense feeling. Yeah, the challenge was more to concentrate on what you could do and how you could make a difference rather than on them. Because if you become too obsessed by them, you can lose the focus for yourselves.
Quick conversation about sleep, because particularly with what you did with running the 350 miles, you didn't sleep for how long?
Well, it was 3 days, and I've got to preface that by saying, you know, in all honesty, I actually woke up in the middle of the road and running, and I thought, I know better than this, there's trucks in the road, you know, so I kind of meandered back over to the shoulder, and then it happened again, and I realized I was sleep running. I was falling asleep and just willing my body to keep going, and I felt kind of rejuvenated when I woke up the second time. And
Wow, this is a very good new
the
skill.
truck doesn't take me out. I think it was good. Yeah.
In an ideal world, how much do you sleep, and in what sort of sections do you sleep in the middle of the day or just at night?
Yeah, I sleep, and this is a sore subject because my wife is here, but I sleep about 4 or 5 hours a night. And she likes to sleep 10 or 12 is even better. So I'm up constantly. You know, it's kind of counterintuitive. You think athletes have to sleep a lot, and I found just the opposite. I sleep less and less the more aerobically fit I've become. Yeah, so 4 or 5 hours seems to recharge the batteries and off to the next run. John, what about you?
Look, this is loosely related to sleep. We had moved into a base camp in Karnarzes. We'd started to do things a bit differently. Had a set camp. Instead of moving around from hotel to hotel when we were playing test matches, we had one basic camp and then we'd fly out from there to play all the games. And the big difference was that when we did this, all our families could come and stay with us. You know, our wives or girlfriends or being rugby players, we only had one or the other. Some sports it's a bit different than that. But the wives and girlfriends and kids, if we had them, could all stay there. And it was funny when we first started doing this, the press would always be looking for a different angle, and they said, yeah, what's the team's policy on sex the night before a game? Won't that distract the team? And the best response I ever heard to that was from a US coach. I think his name was Bum Phillips. It was the Houston Oilers. Someone would know more than I would. But his response was, look, it's not sex the night before the game that concerns me, it's the players staying up all night trying to get it. That's the big issue. I think he was talking about the married guys in the team, not the single guys in the team. Anyway, so look, I mean, sleep is a very important part of... I think one of the big differences in sport and business is, in sport, obviously the main focus is your body. And in business, the main focus is your mind. But the reality is the people who perform the best are the ones who get that balance right. You're never going to get the balance right all the time. There's going to be patches where you can't sleep very well, or you're so busy or whatever, there's things going through your mind. But I think on balance, like if you look over a 1 year period rather than a 1 week or 1 month period, you need to make sure you're getting all those elements in.
Have you found, Steve, a happy balance now with sleep and exercise and mental stimulation?
I probably sleep more now than I used to when I was an athlete. But yeah, beginning my career, that as John says, sleep's very important, the recovery from that sort of process. And one of my heroes that within the sport of rowing, a guy called Tim Crooks, who had retired a few years before when I was just coming onto the team, I raced him at a local regatta. And I was really scared about racing him, even though he'd been retired for 5 years, but he was still pretty a legend in this country. And I didn't sleep a wink during that night. And I went out and raced him and beat him very easily. 2 weeks later, I raced him at Henley Royal Regatta thinking that there's no problem here. I beat him very easily. And we had an epic race that's pretty legendary now. Fortunately, I still won, but it was very, very close from that point of view. And from that point, I thought, well, sleep's important. The human body is amazing. What these guys have done on the end has sort of proved that. But it's the fact of state of mind. It's actually the preparation in some ways of what you think. If everything is in order of exactly of how you want it to be, it doesn't always mean that you'll get that performance. You need that little bit of edge in some ways. So actually, if I didn't have a very good night's sleep, or training hasn't gone that well in the last few weeks, or in the last session before you're doing, if going into a competition, having that little edge is that you know you're not quite at your absolute perfect, it normally brings out a better performance. When everything goes to plan, there's normally something that comes and kicks you in the teeth at that point.
And on that thought, we will leave it for now. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Sir Ranulph, Fiennes, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Steve Redgrave, John Eales, and Dean Karnarzes.